Welcome to Cool Tunes for a Hot Planet, the podcast where music inspires action for social and climate justice.
Hi, and welcome to Cool Tunes for a Hot Planet, Episode 46, Season 2. I'm your host, Warren Senders, and before we get started, please remember to click those like and subscribe buttons so we can keep on bringing you inspiring music and activism all year round. A few months back, we were having a meeting of the podcast team, and I asked for suggestions for a deep dive episode. At the time, there was a lot of news about The Mother of a Revolution, a piece by composer Omar Thomas, which had been banned by a school board in Wisconsin. Eventually, Mr. Thomas's piece was performed by a community orchestra, but the whole thing had us thinking about what happens when music is forbidden. And now here we are with today's episode, If Music is Outlawed, Only Outlaws Make Music. Around 1880, the colonial government of Trinidad banned drumming, which they correctly regarded as a way for the oppressed African population to build solidarity and foster resistance. In response, the people cut bamboo sticks and created the music called Tamboo. In 1955, Pete Seeger, someone who'd had plenty of experience with his music being outlawed, went to Trinidad to learn more about the instruments that emerged when the tamboo was also prohibited in the mid-20th century. So we'll let him tell this part of the story.
Let me tell you something of how steel drums came to be invented. Around World War II, there were laws passed in Trinidad against regular drums and the traditional bamboo stick rhythm bands. So the young people raided the junkyards, and that year they celebrated Carnival with clanging and banging of garbage cans. Then some genius discovered that a dent in the bottom of a garbage can gave off a musical note, and within a few years they'd worked it up to a regular system. This is called a ping-pong. It's the soprano instrument.
The steel drums are now ubiquitous. They're often used to evoke a tropical vibe in movies and TV, and community steel bands are powerful agents of joy all over the world. Banning music is a form of social control, which means that it tracks very closely to the history of despotism and the history of colonialism. Some music was banned because of song texts, which meant either heresy, sexuality, social protest, or some combination of them. Some music was banned because of the ethnicity of its performers and composers, like the Jewish artists whose work was outlawed by Hitler. Some music was banned or forbidden because authorities just didn't like the way it sounded. Stalin made it a crime to use certain compositional techniques. And sometimes it's not music per se, but a particular instrument that fell on the wrong side of an ideological divide, like the tamboo, which was outlawed because of its unfortunate utility as a weapon. There were other reasons why governments tried to suppress particular instruments. At the same time, in the early 20th century, on the other side of the globe, the harmonium was forbidden from appearing on All India Radio as part of the story of the Indian nationalist movement. My guest in this segment is Dr. Matthew Rahaim, a professor of ethnomusicology at the University of Minnesota, in an audio-only interview. I've asked him to join us and tell the story of how a common musical instrument came to be forbidden. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Warren.
What are we looking at here? What's a harmonium, and why was it banned from All India Radio?
If you go to any city in India, really most homes in India even, you will likely discover quickly that this is the commonest instrument. You find it in devotional music, in Hindu settings, Muslim settings, in Qawwali, Sikh devotional music, Christian devotional music. You find it in all kinds of regional folk music. It's everywhere. mid-19th century, missionaries started bringing harmoniums as a way of supporting hymn singing. It's portable, it stays in tune even with dramatic shifts in humidity, it travels well. But very quickly, the Indian craftspeople adapted that missionary harmonium. They made it so you could sit on the floor and play it very easily. So you could think of the missionaries as bringing the prototypes and Indian craftspeople as developing what we now think of as a harmonium. You hear in a lot of the very early recordings, people are accompanying vocal music with harmoniums.
This recording's from about 1910. Muhammad Hussain, harmonium master.
And it isn't until 1910 that anyone seems to think that anything is particularly odd about this. This is in the midst of the Swadeshi movement. Literally, it means something like our own country. And it's a divestment movement, and the idea was boycott British goods and buy stuff we're making ourselves.
Right.
You can think of, one lasting image of this is Gandhi at the spinning wheel.
Yes.
Spinning his own cotton. So the harmonium, suddenly, in light of the Swadeshi movement, you're looking around you, you're suddenly seeing the world around you in terms of us and them in this radical way, and then you see this harmonium sitting in the corner, this keyboard looking back at you, and you're thinking, is this an Indian thing or a British thing? And that's when the criticism of the harmonium got really intense.
And what form did that criticism take?
There are three forms it takes. One is just looking at the harmonium in the corner and saying, that is foreign. That is a foreigner. It's got to get out of here. The second route is hearing it with an ear where there is a Indian way of being in tune and a British way of being in tune. So you look at the harmonium and you think that thing has a different tuning system than we use. We divide our octave differently, and the harmonium is forcing us to hear things in a British way. And then the third form of criticism was we ornament our vocal music in a way that can't be broken down into discrete notes, and the harmonium can only produce broken independent tones. And that in 1910, there was an idea that Western music was inherently fragmented, broken, and Indian music was inherently connected and unified. Both romantics and nationalists, who often ran in similar circles, would say this in a lot of different ways and kind of map that onto social order. So the idea was a continuous glide is a map of relationships. That's that's our social life is connected and relational. Their social life is fragmented. Everyone lives in their own apartments. No one sees their grandparents anymore. Just this terrible vision of fragmented, broken, industrial, modern social life.
So the instrument became a kind of synecdoche for everything wrong with the British society.
Yes.
Vande Mataram is one of the pivotal songs of the independence movement. The text is in a mix of Bengali and Sanskrit, is by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Here's a contemporary 78 RPM disc of the song as performed by Vishnupant Pagnis. The song was hugely important and very popular in the Indian independence movement, so much so that the British colonial government banned public performances, thereby making just singing the song a form of civil disobedience. At the same time, this helped normalize the idea that music and musical instruments could be prohibited, an idea that was subsequently applied to the harmonium. Enter Rabindranath Tagore, Nobel laureate, world-renowned poet, and ardent Indian nationalist.
Rabindranath Tagore was a major discursive architect of this. So if you read his memoirs, he has this amazing section where he describes his childhood with great nostalgia. He describes himself singing, by the water with a tanpura on his shoulder. And he says the harmonium, that bane of Indian music, was not then in vogue. So he says, I refuse to subject myself to the slavery of the keyboard.
Enter John Folds.
John Folds, English composer, he was the head of the Western music section at All India Radio Delhi. He gathered all these strands together and published an article called The Harmonium in 1938. This is when he said loud and clear, this is an un-Indian instrument. And this is the article that really, I think, tipped the scales. So March 1st, 1940, that's the ban. It's hard to really get a sense of just how huge All India Radio was as an employer of musicians at this time. It was steady, it paid well, it was respectable, right? If you were a staff artist at All India Radio, you were well taken care of. So if you're a harmoniumist and suddenly you are no longer welcome on the airwaves, you have lost a major pillar of your livelihood. You suddenly have to go scrambling for other ways to make money.
Your whole life is upended. Govindra Tendri playing a composition in Raga Pilu.
The ban was lifted partially. In 1971, you again heard harmoniums accompanying singers on All India Radio. But if you were a harmoniumist, it didn't make such a huge difference to your livelihood at that point. You're still kind of on the outside.
The harmonium continues to be absolutely central. It's still found everywhere. The instruments are overwhelmingly manufactured in India, and they are considered to be a very typical Indian instrument. But there's still this penumbra of controversy.
For sure, yeah, and I would include in that there are singers who will, perform with a harmoniumist and give a beautiful concert at 6 p.m. And then at 9 p.m. Talk about how un-Indian this instrument is. So those two registers coexist without contradiction. That's all alive and well now. You will find harmoniums in yoga studios in the West.
Yes.
Where what is sometimes called kirtan, done in the form of a bhajan or devotional music.
And the sound establishes a connection with India.
Right, yes, the link to what India is really supposed to sound like. But
it sounds like augmented seconds.
So I think what I want to say is that it reminds us to have a sense of humor about it, because the 100 years apart, you had people absolutely determined that the harmonium sounded like what India was not, and then people equally convinced with absolute conviction that the harmonium sounds like what India is.
Yeah.
And to give you an example, the kind of comparable contestation over nationalist sound in Trinidad hinges on, is our essential sound Afro-Trinidadian or Indo-Trinidadian? And for those who believe that the sound is Afro-Trinidadian, the model is the steelpan.
The steel drum.
For those who believe that the essential sound of Trinidad is Indian, the essential model is a harmonium. Right, of all the instruments, right, that you could have imagined, in Trinidad, the sound of the harmonium sounds out this essential Indianness in that nationalist debate. in Afghanistan, right, in kind of Afghan classical circles, you have a Persian tuning model, and you have instruments with frets placed in these ways that is not 12-tone equal temperament. It tends to be divided in 17 or 19 tones. Mm-hmm. And that is regarded as the Persian way. And what do you think the instrument is that is a model for the Indian way? It's the harmonium.
Matt Rahaim, thank you so much. The harmonium's position in Afghani music makes a good segue as we look at the far more stringent ban imposed by the Taliban after the Soviets left Afghanistan in 1989, and the remarkable work of a group of dedicated artists and educators who brought Afghani music back to life. My guest in this segment is Derek Beckvold. Derek is currently the director of Teach to Learn, an international music education organization, and in 2012, 2013, and 2014, he was on the faculty of, is it the Afghani Conservatory of Music?
The Afghan National Institute of Music in Kabul.
And this is in the period when the Taliban was sort of in retreat.
They were in retreat in Kabul at least, but in the rest of the country, you know, there was a lot of strongholds there. But where the people I was with in Kabul, it did feel like a bit of a refuge, and music flourished. You know, the Soviets invaded in 1979, took over the country. When they left, there was a civil war, lots of factions. Out of that, the Taliban sort of rose to the top and became the controlling force in the capital. And that was in the later half of the 90s up until 2001. So that ban, you know, was sort of in place during that period of their rule then. How it took effect, I think, was different in different places. You know, it was sort of from a extremist religious view that music is haram, they would say, and, you know, not acceptable in their eyes.
Dr. Ahmed Sarmast is the founder and director of the Afghan National Institute of Music.
During the Taliban time, listening to music was a crime. If someone was caught listening to music, they could end up in a prison for a few days. If someone was caught playing a musical instrument, they could risk getting cut their hands. But even in that time, the Taliban did not manage to prevent people from listening to music. They did not manage to fully silence the people of Afghanistan.
So when they were ousted from power in 2001, the conditions were ripe for a lot of Western investment and a Western kind of schools were opened up. There was a lot of stuff that was opening up, and music was just one of those things that was kind of started to take off. There was some funding and support from international funders, various countries and embassies, but also the Ministry of Education. And they brought in someone in Dr. Ahmed Sarmast to sort of found the school.
It's a milestone for a country where music was banned up to 10 years ago. But within a very short period of time since the establishment of the Afghanistan National Institute of Music, we've been able to bring enormous changes, not only to the musical life of the country, but also to the life of our own students. It's a milestone when a small music school can become a leading role in bringing about social changes.
I came in 2012 as a saxophone teacher. That was the official job, but it was a crazy, amazing school with lots of commotion and everybody running everywhere. And it was grades 4 all the way up through 14. Big, wide range of kids and young adults of different ages, and all packed into one school. I was teaching saxophone, private lessons. I had a little saxophone ensemble, eventually started a saxophone quartet, did some teaching of flute, music history, a recording class. I had a little DIY recording studio with Pro Tools, which is pretty cool. There was a music theory. I was doing some wind ensemble stuff. I wasn't the main wind ensemble person, but some conducting. I was playing in the orchestra. We were doing admin work. I helped to develop a curriculum for what would have been the groundwork for a new Afghan Conservatory of Music, which would have continued it. So there was like a million different things. You're always pulled into other stuff, playing gigs and constantly just dipping into everything.
Playing gigs. Were you gigging in Afghanistan?
A little bit. Yeah.
Playing what?
There weren't a lot of venues, but there was actually one place called The Venue. So we played at The Venue, and then the school would go out and play at different places around the city. All quite secure. You have to go through layers of security and whatnot.
Was there a resurgence in Afghani traditional music? Were there people who'd been playing it or practicing it in secret during the time of the Taliban?
Yeah. I heard stories from musicians who kind of lived through that period, and that they were hiding instruments in ceilings and buried underground and in walls, fake walls, and, playing under, quietly in people's homes. You can't prevent people from making music, making sound, coming together. It's always going to happen. And so try as they might to tamp it down, people will always find a way. And it's always the most inspiring thing to hear the stories. And even since the Taliban came back in 2021, in August 2021, there's still music happening. It's just people are underground, and it will always.
Are you hearing from people about that, or do you have contacts there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's delicate, and certainly in the immediate aftermath of that, there were a lot of people trying, especially musicians and artists, who were trying to get out of the country and teach to learn, help support some of those people to relocate them, and we were part of a larger consortium of folks helping musicians relocate, because musicians are particularly at risk. So musicians had this brief window of time when they could go out and play, but even then it wasn't always safe. People were threatened. I knew folks who were threatened verbally, physically. There was a suicide bomber targeting the director of the school, among others. So it was always he ended up in the hospital, and there's always kind of an ongoing threat, even when it was, unbanned. A lot of the music venues were highly secured, and it's a different kind of environment to be making art, but in a way that's where it needs to happen. That's why I was just so inspired by so many Afghans who never gave up and are resilient people. And now there are a lot of folks who are still in Afghanistan, and so many of the artists, musicians who are carrying on the tradition. They're spread out around the world, and so it's really a unique situation where the diaspora is. There's a burden. I think folks feel a responsibility.
They feel that, yeah,
to carry on, to keep these cultural traditions and this music and the storytelling and their culture alive until the day that they can get back and make it thrive in the country where it's supposed to.
And what kind of music did you hear just on the street?
That pop stuff really was like everywhere.
Absolutely ubiquitous.
Coming out of little shops that would sell you like cookies or crackers, with like a little bodega kind of place, and to the hair salon, to the restaurant, to the whatever. It's just constantly coming out of every car. The Elvis of Afghanistan. Certainly, he was a big artist in like the 70s. And there's also, traditional rabab players that were quite well known as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, where did you go after Afghanistan? You've had quite a long history of working in different areas in the world that had a lot of trouble.
I lived multiple lifetimes before I ended up returning to Boston in 2017. I was in India for a couple of years, in Delhi, a bunch of work in Nepal, spent a good chunk of time in Sri Lanka, throughout the Middle East, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, Turkmenistan, Sudan.
During that whole time, you were involved in kind of reweaving the fabric of music. You were helping give people back their lives.
In all of these sort of adverse conditions, when people are in such a tight spot and the world around them is in many ways out of their control, they don't have the agency maybe that they would like to have, or the resources or whatever, that they are able to have agency with their own voice, with their own creativity, and no one can take that away. So it's really, really special to see what people are creating.
Derek Beckvold, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Warren.
Thank you for all the work you've done.
Of course. Thank you.
One of the most fascinating stories of musical resistance is the roentgenizdat, the musical X-rays of the Soviet Union.
Будем слушать запрещенную в Советском Союзе музыку в стиле рок-н-ролл.
This short segment relies heavily on the stories told by British musician and collector Stephen Coates and his remarkable book, Bone Music. After World War II, record-cutting lathes were smuggled into Russia, as well as plans that showed people how to build their own. At the same time, Soviet hospitals had a serious safety problem. Their X-ray films were extremely flammable, so they couldn't be kept after they'd been used for diagnosis. That meant they were thrown away, or more precisely, given to bootleggers, who cut them into rough circles and incised them with grooves. The result was a scratchy, distorted, hissy, clicky match made in heaven, as any and every kind of music was copied and sold undercover. If you had the right contacts, you could get the Andrews Sisters, popular Russian artists like Pyotr Leschenko, or as late as the early 1960s, the Beatles. The people who made and sold the roentgenizdat risked a great deal for the music. Entrepreneurial music lovers like Rudi Fuchs wound up spending 3 years in prison for the crime of dubbing records onto X-ray film. This subversive use of technology is a good way to lead us into the next segment, in which a humble box of matches takes on a new role. Henrique Eisenmann is a faculty member at Juilliard School of Music. He's a pianist, a composer, an expert in jazz and Brazilian music, and a longtime friend. I've asked him here to tell us a fascinating story of how a humble matchbox became the center of a musical resistance to Brazil's dictatorships in the 1930s and the 1960s.
The beginning of the history of samba is a history of evasion, where musicians who play that type of music had kind of to hide, because that music was often associated with West African religions, mostly like orishas type of religions, that in Brazil gained a different name. It was called candomblé and umbanda. And in Brazil, there was the religion was one of the big problems. The religions were forbidden. The music wasn't necessarily forbidden, but the problem is that it's really hard to separate the music and the religion, especially when you talk about West African culture in general. So differently than in the US, where percussion was abolished in the 1700s. You know, in Brazil, there was not a formal ban to percussion. It was even, in certain areas, percussion was even encouraged as a way to keep the enslaved populations appeased, as long as they went into a church at the end and got the blessing from the local priest, you know. So all those were like different forms of authority, colonial authorities trying to exercise their power. But in Brazil, in the beginning, if we talk especially about like the middle of the 1800s, you know, entering the 1900s, you do have a culture where police would just like break away. If there was a group of people playing samba, no, this is way too much. Just stop that. So in context like that, the matchbox is the perfect, you know, perfect instrument. You just tuck it in your pocket and you pretend, no, that's nothing. You know, it's just my regular smoke. It reminds me of the beginning of capoeira, that was actually a martial arts that the enslaved population was training in order to be able to defend themselves. And then police would, you know, arrest people if they were practicing it. So they started to say that it was actually a dance. Oh no, we're just dancing. This is not martial arts, it's just dance. Look, we're moving so gracefully. This is our dance. In Brazil, everything becomes percussion. It was very common to have artists play samba in this tiny little caixinha de fósforo. There's this very important figure that we called in Portuguese malandro. And malandro is like a street urban trickster. He's always well dressed with like a nice suit. He knows how to evade authority. He may be involved in some illicit activity here and there, but he's really smart and really talented. And the matchbox is one of the symbols of this figure. It's always the person who's like going to find a way to trick the authorities. And there's so many lyrics that talk about this. You know, like famous Brazilian composer Chico Buarque made a samba that's called a homage to the malandro.
Eu fui fazer sambinha, homenagem na nata da malandragem, que conheço de outros carnavais. Eu fui a Lapa e perdi a viagem daquela tal malandragem. Não existe mais, agora já não é normal. Que dá de malandro regular, profissional, malandro com aparelho de malandro oficial, malandro.
And that he says, like, in the past we used to have the stricters on the street, but now they are in Congress. That's basically his modern take on it, you know.
Malandro com contrato, com gravata e capital. Que nunca se dá mal, mas o malandro tá valendo. Não espalha, aposentou a navalha. Tem mulheres que me traga e tal. Dizem as más línguas que ele até trabalha, mora lá longe, chacoalha.
And then during the 30s, when Brazil had a dictatorship, they tried to impose upon samba composers the the idea of writing only patriotic sambas and nothing about this figure of this lazy malandro figure that's against the law, so basically trying to foster a sense of new national identity. So when you hear the Aquarela do Brasil, that famous samba that's all about the beauty and the coconut trees and the tropical glory of Brazil, that was part of a political campaign, that was trying to kind of hide this whole part of samba being more of an urban trickster culture.
Este coqueiro que dá toco, foi onde amarra minha rede, nas noites claras de luar, Brasil, Brasil. Oh, e essas fontes murmurantes, foi onde eu mato a minha sede, e onde a lua vem brincar. Oh, esse Brasil lindo e trigueiro é o meu Brasil brasileiro, terra de samba e pandeiro, Brasil, Brasil, pra mim.
One of the greatest players of Caixinha de Fósforo is this famous samba composer called Elton Medeiros. It has this thing where he would say, like, it cannot be too full, but also not too empty. You have to have, like, about maybe 25 matches inside your box. And the box needs to be made out of wood. So in Brazil, there's a you still can buy on the supermarket, the wooden one that's perfect. So you can either play like a Brazilian tambourine, where you have the accents, like your clave, so to speak, and with your other finger, or on the back or on the side, you hit all the negative spaces. I like to teach like this. You hit twice and one shake. So basically.
Wow.
It feels really good. So I don't know, like.
You have a song?
Só faço o favor de me trazer depressa uma boa beijo que não seja requentado, um pão bem quente com manteiga, beça e guardanapo, e um copo d'água bem gelado. Fecha a porta da direita com muito cuidado, que não estou disposto a ficar exposto ao sol. Vai perguntar ao seu freguês do lado qual foi o resultado do futebol. This is a malandro samba, for example. It's talking about the guy talking, hey, waiter, can you bring me a cold beer and a coffee, but please not a reheated coffee, I want some fresh coffee. Please go ask someone for the result of the soccer match and all of that. This is a samba from the 20s, just before the dictatorship. In Brazil went from 1930s to 1945. It was a very weird type of dictatorship because it was a very populist government that in one hand was very good to workers' rights, for example. That's when like the Bill of Working Rights was created in Brazil. So in one way it was very good. On the other one, it was a time of a lot of torture and brutality, police brutality, and there was a lot of censorship. There was a department that was destined to censorship, where every piece of music had to go through it. Most composers had to flee the country. You know, some went to London, some went to Rome, some went to Paris. And the slightest comment about the government, you could disappear. Yeah, there was a bleak time. It took time.
Now, what was the difference between that and the dictatorship in 1965?
Oh, that's a great point. So in 1965 was a strictly like right-wing dictatorship, extremely conservative, fan of fascist governments, and it was. The dictatorship started in 64, but it only became absolutely impossible to live there in 69 when they basically abolished constitution. Because before that, around from 64 to 69, is, in my opinion, is the most fertile moment in Brazilian popular music. You have Gilberto Gil, Caetano Veloso, Chico Buarque, Tom Jobim, writing music that sometimes was about either the life of marginalized people in Brazil or like a direct attack on the government. But the themes are fantastic. The poetry is incredible. This is around the same time when you also have like Canción Nueva all over Latin America, from Argentina to Chile, and people like Victor Jara, who was a big, activist / singer-songwriter, also writing music around the same time. And there's also this renaissance of folkloric music in Brazil, because to play folkloric music at that time in Brazil was an act of resistance in a way.
A vida, oh, chorando, eu vi a mocidade perdida, fim da tempestade.
This is a partnership of Elton Medeiros and Cartola. Cartola is known to be one of the greatest samba singers that was still active during the 60s and 70s, who had a really difficult life, was poor most of his life. He only became known when he was 70. He used to work at a gas station. Elton Medeiros was a percussionist that also started writing songs, and he's the one playing.
Yeah.
This is a tune called O Sol Nascerá. It means the sun will be born. And it means basically let's smile as the next day is coming, because I already cried too much.
A vida, oh, chorando, eu vi a mocidade.
It has a message of hope. You hear this all the time in samba jam sessions if you go to Rio. And Cartola and his wife, called Dona Zica, they became very important figures in samba during the 60s and 70s. Although he wasn't political, I'm sure he was also on the lookout by the authorities,
Fala por mim, violão, chama pra roda o surdo tamborim. Decifra o recado que trago no coração, que o samba sabe quando vou e por que vim. Eu sou assim, pouco de morro, outro tanto cidade assim. A madrugada deixou pra ti.
It's basically a tribute to samba, saying that samba is a little bit from the mountain. When you say from the mountain, you mean from the favelas, from the communities, and the other part from the city is the city and the community all together. And basically, he talks about the instruments of samba and how it's the music from the streets, is the music of early morning, is the music of the night, and there's so many songs that actually are just tributes to the culture of samba and how it operates. So this is one of them. I think it has this nostalgic vibe, and that's one of the interesting paradigms of Latin American music, that on one hand you have such a rhythmic rigor, or at least like this propelling rhythmic element that never stops, that pushes forward. And on the other side, you have the melody being so laid back or so lyrical.
Mas o seu calor ilumina o céu. Sou tão somente pedaço de lua que reflete o samba pro povo da rua. Beber a ilusão e dançar a alegria. Deixe essa estrela brilhar livremente e ver a pulsação desse samba latente. Incendiar o dia. Fala por mim. Fala por mim, violão.
You hear that many times. If you try to transcribe that, it's so hard. It's not at all on the grid. The notes are not aligning. It's very free. But at the same time, it's perfect. And that's one interesting thing that I find it has to do with the cosmology of how West African music also operates, where if you have a pulse, the melody will absolutely never align. Everybody in Brazil will sing. It makes sense to everybody.
Fala por mim.
And that's it for this episode. I'd like to thank Matt Rahaim, Derek Beckvold, Henrique Eisenmann, Ahmed Sarmast, Pete Seeger, and all the musicians whose art we shared. When authoritarians are trying harder than ever to control our expression, we can always feel inspired by the many different ways that music grows through the cracks and reaches toward the sun. You can check out this QR code for information about Third Act and to find opportunities for activism in your area. For the credits, we'll hear Hello, performed by Devin Ramutar on harmonium, Rohan Sham Deonarayan on tabla and dholak, and Bisham Hariprasad on steel drum. Please like and subscribe and share this podcast with your friends. I'm Warren Senders, and this has been Cool Tunes for a Hot Planet, Episode 46, Season 2. If music is outlawed, only outlaws make music. Thank you for listening. You can find out more about Derek Beckvold's work in international music education at teachtolearn.life. For information about the state of artistic freedom around the world, please visit freemuse.org.
Cool Tunes for a Hot Planet is produced by Jack Cochran, Pam Falkenberg, Pearlie Ray Gates, Seth Handelman, James Kahn, Harriet Jerusha Coram, Mark Lagerway, Warren Senders. Janelle Chang is our intern.
Cool Tunes for a Hot Planet. Watch it. Cool Tunes for a Hot Planet. Watch it.